And so I just don't think a lot of these brands are in the place where it's going to help them or help their dealers to have their pre-owned watches, no matter whether they're certified with a warranty and all this stuff, sitting next to their new product. It's not generally a good look. And I think that's a big part of the reason you're seeing either the brand's just not interested in the case of Swatch and Omega, or in the case of Richemont, you're seeing them try these different approaches. This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Apkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Chapex, Artori Biard, Arcanaut, and more. To learn more about us and check our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Well, once more, speaking of available inventory, well, not our available inventory, but inventory that's just available out there in the world. Today, we are talking about the rise of certified pre-owned programs, or maybe the rise of a certified pre-owned program. But we're going to take a broader look at the overall state of the certified pre-owned program world. We're going to talk about the value of these programs and to whom that value accrues, and where we see this whole thing going.
And to do that, we have the perfect guest, the man himself, the cigar aficionado, the number cruncher, and I believe our only guests to have returned more than twice, Hamza Masood of WatchCharts, which is, of course, the most comprehensive, transparent, and trusted source of watch market data. Hamza and WatchCharts were among the first to track and call out the rise and growing importance of certified pre-owned programs, and that's why we have you here today. Hamza, once again, welcome back to Open Work. You know, we should start doing that thing that news networks do. So should we make you the pre-owned correspondent for Open Work?
Oh, they don't call them correspondents when they have these people who like talking heads. They're like contributors, I think.
There you go. So there you go. Open Work contributor. Hamza Masood.
Usually those are paid positions. So
okay, well, so we have volunteer contributor Hamza Masood.
I'll take it. Thank you for having me back, gentlemen. How are you?
It's good to see you, my friend. So let's dive in.
Yeah.
So since Rolex announced their CPO program in 2023, you and as a factor of you, WatchCharts has been one of the loudest voices in this business about the growth of that program and its potential implications for the industry. I'm curious, when that started 2 years ago, the program was essentially a shadow of its current self. It's grown quite significant. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's three figures, like hundreds of doors now that are participating in the program. So what made you think that this was going to be what it turned out to be?
I think back in December 2022, there was no data to indicate that it would be successful or grow or be anything. At that point, it was just an intuition. And that intuition led me to say, okay, let's just keep a close eye on how things develop. And then when we started doing that, we realized, okay, 6 months later, Tourneau joined. And then later that year, I believe, if I remember my dates correctly, the 1916 company joined. A handful of smaller authorized dealers in the US, in Europe, in the UK started sort of coming on board. And then when you see players at multiple sizes start to join, the obviously the natural question from that is, well, okay, what is going on here? Why is it that, let's say a single store authorized dealer in the Midwest that doesn't do, a ton of business like Bucher does, had no pre-existing pre-owned business much to speak of. Why are they getting into it? And I think that connected with another intuition that I had back in December 2022, which is sort of just based on this outsider's perspective of observing Rolex just as an enthusiast and a collector. There's this mythos around the brand that like they are very serious about everything they do, and they're very deliberate and they don't do things that they're not willing to commit to, and so on and so forth. But of course, the reality is like any company will make mistakes as well as have successes, but certainly they seem to have much more successes than failures. So if they're willing to invest in launching this program and enter a market that they have never been inside before, then they must have thought about this deeply. And I think that showed in the way that the program rolled out. So then, of course, over time, as the program continued to grow, the evidence that we needed to keep a closer eye on it grew. And at that point, there was more of a business case than just an intuition that said, this is something interesting. So yes, in absolute terms from where it was, I think it's grown considerably, but depending on the perspective you take, it has many orders of magnitude left to grow.
Yeah, it's interesting, thinking back to that time, and Asher, you're right, Hamza was one of the first people to point out to me that CPO had real potential. And I remember at the time having the mindset that I think a lot of other people who are, hardcore watch enthusiasts had, which is, well, I mean, I'm not so sure that sounds like a very compelling value proposition. Like, I don't know. I don't want to pay like all that much more money to have a Rolex dealer, service a watch and tell me it's authentic and give me a guarantee. Like, I can just buy a Rolex pre-owned from any reputable watch dealer and I'm good to go and I'll save myself some money. But you saw the potential. It's worth discussing what exactly is a certified pre-owned program and the value that it offers before we get into a little bit more on Rolex and the industry overall. I think it's helpful to define terms and just generally speaking, what sets a certified pre-owned watch apart from a pre-owned watch?
The customer value proposition, I think, is where it makes sense to start. So, you guys worked in tech, and so it's all about like, what does the user want? What will the user do? Like, how does this help the user? And so I think the value proposition there also really starts with the customer saying, this is a product I want to buy. But what is the product that they are buying? In the pre-owned market, generally before, you could buy a pre-owned watch from an Instagram dealer, or you could pay a little bit more and get peace of mind from a larger player like, at the time, the company that was known as Watchbox, right? Or you could buy a pre-owned watch from Booker. These larger retailers would offer their own warranties and authenticity guarantees, each of which mean something slightly different. So the authenticity guarantee is just, we know this is not a watch that's coming out of the factory, but we guarantee that every single part of it is 100% genuine and authentic, and we will stand behind that. And then the warranty is that this watch is guaranteed to work properly. And if within the warranty period you have any issues, come back to us and we'll fix it free of charge under the terms of the warranty. Both of which are things that you receive as part of the new watch buying experience from any brand. When you were buying a pre-owned watch from Watchbox, what they were essentially offering you was a certified pre-owned watch, but where they themselves had done the certification as opposed to Rolex as the brand standing behind the certification. So I think what's changed now with certified pre-owned, or what does really sort of differentiate brand certified pre-owned, I suppose, from what is arguably maybe CPO, maybe not, if it's just the retailer doing it, is that the brand now stands behind both the warranty and the authenticity guarantee. So Rolex says it's not London Jewelers or 1916 Company or Booker or Watches of Switzerland or Finks or whatever your local authorized dealer is. It's not them standing behind the guarantee and the warranty. It's Rolex saying, we guarantee that this is 100% authentic and we are willing to put our name behind that. And if anything goes wrong with it, this is an international 2-year warranty. Take this watch anywhere there's a Rolex authorized service center. If they, sort of inspect it and there's an issue with it, it will be fixed according to the terms of the warranty. So that's really, I think, the differentiating factor where you're not just buying something from the person in front of you, you're buying something from the brand that is willing to put its weight behind the product. And that brings a lot of peace of mind for a lot of people. I think as enthusiasts, we tend to say, oh, I can trust my local authorized dealer who's in my local collector group because I know the guy, I see him once a month, we like grab drinks or whatever. And if he's selling me a sub, I can trust him, like generally like the way people say in the secondary market, buy the dealer. Certified pre-owned is essentially no longer needing to buy the dealer, but to just buy the brand again. That really, I think, is the big difference. And for a lot of people, I don't think the value of that can be understated. Again, as enthusiasts, because of the price difference and whatever, we'll always maybe be okay with paying less to get a product. But I think for CPO, not only will a lot of people just switch who are already in this world, but it will also bring in a new customer entirely.
Okay, there are two essentially competing things happening in this market right now, which I find interesting. You have these Veblen goods, right? So the many 41 millimeter Submariners that exist in the market today, and then you have of which the price is being set by the market, right? Like there's X amount in the market, there's Y amount that want to buy it. they'll meet at a combined price. That is what the product is worth at this given time. And then you have this added value, if you will, of the CPO program, the extended warranty, the peace of mind, everything you just described, and the fact that retailers aren't working on a set margin here. They're buying these watches at whatever they can get them for. They're trying to buy them for the least they can relative to the market, like anyone would, and then mark it up as high as they can because they have the CPO fig leaf, as you were, that adds that extra value. And what I find interesting here is, given that this is completely novel to a lot of retailers, that they've stepped into this space that is now full of things that they're not used to. Because a primary market sale is a primary market sale. A Submariner costs what a Submariner costs in New York. It costs the same in Los Angeles. And that's that. But of course, a pre-owned Submariner is highly variable relative to who has it, who's selling it, its condition, its scope of delivery, all of that. Not to mention the fact that now you're competing in a digital landscape of which there are many folks out there that are very capable and talented and know how to digitally market, know how to use digital advertising, know how to find clients. So this is a very new muscle for retailers. So I'm curious, as we go through the list of folks that are exploring this, to look at it from two perspectives. There's the client side, like why would a client buy this? Is there client interest? But I'm also interested to look at it from the AD side, which is, in the grand scheme of things here, like, I'm curious to see if ADs are either making money doing this, because I don't think that's a foregone conclusion. And when I say make money, I mean in terms of net profit, not gross revenue. And I also am curious to know, in the end, what the brands, because I do think it varies by brand, what they see as the real advantage. Because I think we can all figure that out for Rolex. But as we pivot over to some of these other brands, I don't think it's quite so clear. So let's take a look for a moment at some of the numbers here for Rolex.
As of the end of Q2, we can see over 110 authorized dealers worldwide. In the US, there's just under 50 of them. So that's authorized dealers. If you count the number of stores in the US, I think it's something like 95-ish, somewhere between 90 and 100. Worldwide, it's over 225 doors where certified pre-owned is now being sold. 8,500 roughly active listings that are available online. There are some retailers who don't list everything online, so the real number is probably higher. And then our estimate for how much gross revenue the program pulled in last year for all participating retailers was around 300 million. Our prediction, or projection rather, for this year is 400 million. But again, there is a portion of that we are not capturing because we never get to see that data. So the true size of the program could be a little bit larger. Those do sound like pretty big numbers, but they have to be placed in the context of the broader secondary market, where for Rolex globally, there might be something like 1 million active listings at any given time across all websites. And so 8,500 listings is it's still a drop in the bucket. And then even in terms of revenue, Rolex alone is maybe doing $12 to $15 billion on the secondary market annually, globally. So, to get to 500 million is, yes, in absolute terms, that's a big number. But in relative terms, like how much of a bite is CPO taking out of the broader secondary market, even now, 2.5 years after the launch of the program, it's still relatively very, very small.
Yeah. And, what's interesting about Rolex is that there are many desirable watches within the Rolex family. There's lots of references that people want. But when we pivot over to the next topic or the next brand, because I do want to spend a good portion of time looking at everybody else, let's talk a little bit about AP. And AP is a bit different, really, because when we talk about like watches that command premiums from AP, they're in high demand on the secondary market. And correct me if I'm wrong, Hamza, but like AP demand has been in relative decline for some time now on the secondary, although they're still retaining value for sure. It's the Royal Oak. So I guess I would ask in this scenario, and this is interesting because of course AP, with a few exceptions, no longer has authorized dealers. So I guess the question here is, why does AP want to be in this business? And I can editorialize, but I'm curious for your point of view.
My opinion is that any brand will do certified pre-owned because they see it as a continuation of, ironically, a story that I've heard Mr. Willem Schmidt tell a few times. So I've heard him talk about why he believes that A. Lange & Söhne should be sold through the brand's own boutiques. It's because he feels very strongly that they can convey the story and the messaging of their brand and their watches better than anybody else. And I think a brand choosing to launch a certified pre-owned program is them essentially making the claim that they can do exactly that, which is tell the story of their brand and, market their product and stand behind their product, not just in the primary market, but even in its subsequent lives. Like Rolex says in its marketing materials, our watches live many lives. I think it's I forget the exact phrasing, but it's something like that. And so I think it's not purely a financial motivation, I think, to think, oh, if we sell CPO, we will make, a ton of money. I don't think like the CPO program for Rolex, for example, from my understanding of how it's structured, is one that is, greatly lucrative in any way. I think it's more sort of from a strategic standpoint for propping up long-term brand equity, brand value, which is different from prices. So prices could still be above or below retail or whatever, but essentially saying like, even if you're buying one of these watches on the secondary market, you can be guaranteed that you're going to get a quality product because it's still got our name on it. And so we care that you get a quality experience with it, is why any brand, Rolex, Audemars Piguet, smaller, bigger, would want to get into this space.
So one follow-up on that before we move on. So with Rolex, this is an issue. With AP, to me, this strikes me as a like glaring, like just fiery red fireball of warning, which is AP is notorious for not just being obsessed about tracking people who resell their watches, but being antagonistic to those people who resell their watches and treating them disrespectfully. There's a lot of stories out there about that. And I'm curious how they square that circle with a certified pre-owned program. Because if you have hundreds, maybe thousands of people who have received aggressive phone calls or inappropriate emails from AP demanding why they sold a watch, how are they ever going to square that with reselling their own watches?
I don't think they think about it that way. I'm curious, Hamza, for your perspective, but
I recognize they don't think about it that way. I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, well, their mindset about that. I don't think they're even interested in squaring that circle or view it as a contradiction. From what I understand about AP, from what I've observed of their behavior,
from what you've experienced.
From what I've experienced, it's about control. It gives them more control. Think about the fact, you mentioned this, they've pulled most of their third-party authorized dealers. They want control and they want value capture. And having a pre-owned program gives them more control and more value capture. There are challenges with that as well, but for me, it's like, well, of course, AP would be one of the first to line up and do this. It gives them more control over what's happening with their watches on the secondary market. Now,
so you don't think they think about the hypocritical nature of it?
No, and I don't even think about the fact that, to Hamza's point, even with a program as big as Rolex, they're pissing in the wind. Like how big could AP's CPO program ever get? They're a small company, so there is no control they could ever really have over their pre-owned market. But it's like, there's that old story, that old fable of like the scorpion, who tells whoever it is, like, oh, I'm not going to sting you. You can trust me. And then what does the scorpion do? It goes ahead and stings the other animal. Why? Because it's a scorpion and that's its nature. To me, that's a little bit of what's going on with AP. They're so obsessed with control. How could they help themselves other than creating a certified pre-owned program, regardless of whether you think it's hypocritical or whether I think it's a rounding error on the market for their watches.
Yeah, I guess the other way to look at it.
Those are our conspiracy theories.
No. But I mean, you raise a valid point, which is, I guess, if you're in the market for like a 15,500 or something, and you're looking at the secondary market for it, you probably don't have a relationship with them. Maybe you haven't experienced some of the behaviors that they've historically conducted. So maybe what makes sense that we're engaged in. So maybe in this case, you're right. It's like it's nothing relative to their overall revenue. The clients that are going to buy it weren't necessarily clients that were, potentially boutique customers to begin with. I just find it fascinating. Like, what is the conversation that would be had between a, AP house buyer and their client after selling them that they can't sell their watches except to them?
I think what I would say to sort of all of the speculation is that it is just that, it's speculation. AP,
for sure.
They have indicated a desire to launch a certified pre-owned program, and they have, hired to that end, but there is nothing that has been publicly launched yet. So what the contours of that program look like, unclear. What the customer experience will look like, unknown. How has Rolex done it? They are only allowing Rolex authorized dealers who are already selling new product to also sell CPO. So that's obviously not something that, the other brand can do because they don't have very many, if any, authorized dealers left. But I think it really starts, again, to go back to what I said earlier about Rolex as well, right? The aim is to bring in a customer and provide them a customer experience where you can be reassured that even though the product you are buying is pre-owned, that the product is genuine, that you have a good experience trying it on and then eventually buying it, and that if you ever need after-sales care, that Rolex and its representatives will take care of you. So what is the analog of that for a different brand? And would they choose to do any of those things differently, either for structural reasons or because they have a different view on it? I think remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
So what they end up doing and what that customer experience will look like, I think it remains very much an open question for me.
Thank you for saying that, because you're right. Rolex is certainly, it wasn't the first, won't be the only, but it's so big and has so much attention that it's kind of become the quote unquote template, right? And, if you look at other categories like automotive, CPO programs are relatively uniform.
Yeah.
From brand to brand, whether it's a luxury brand or a mass market brand, whether it's owned by the Volkswagen Group or it's owned by Toyota or whomever, they generally all operate kind of the same way. But I don't think that's a foregone conclusion in watches, because the more I've thought about the analog between cars and watches and the certified pre-owned programs, the more it breaks down. And a good example of that, you pointed out there are a number of other brands who are actually doing certified pre-owned programs. So we've got Rolex, AP is hiring and figuring it out, putting it in place. We'll see where they go. But there are smaller indie brands who have done it. So Richard Mille has a program, Journe has a program, Urwerk has a program. One interesting model for it, though, is MB&F's program, because they're doing something that's quite different from the Rolex model, which is they have dealers who are MB&F certified pre-owned dealers. So an example of that would be in the United States, Esperlux, not an MB&F dealer, but an MB&F certified pre-owned dealer, which I think is an interesting distinction. Now, that's an even smaller program, and there are probably other considerations that go into why MB&F has decided to structure it that way versus maybe the way it's structured in other industries or Rolex has done it. But it points out that what we may end up seeing here is not there's one way that CPO works in watches, just like there is in cars. There may be actually a variety of ways. And I think some of the other holding companies start to point that out. So I think worth discussing is the way Richemont has approached this.
Well, before we go there, the MB&F and the Urwerk thing is really fascinating to me, because that actually makes so much more just logical sense across the board. I mean, if you think about Urwerk, and I guess to a degree MB&F as well, most of the releases that they make annually are like 20 to 30 pieces per reference. So those watches, once they're gone, they're gone. So, creating a unified set. Also, some of those watches are, idiosyncratic and require the care and service of an MB&F watchmaker.
With Urwerk in particular, that's certainly the reason they have that program. How many people can service those?
Yeah, so I totally see a very logical reason to say, I'm buying a certified pre-owned MB&F, or I see a reason to say I would be an MB&F certified pre-owned retailer, because if there were, we know that with the growth of those brands, there are more people than the watches, generally speaking, and rehoming them through a formal channel makes a ton of sense to me relative to some of the more some of the higher production number watches that we were just talking about from, say, an AP or a Rolex or even a hypothetical Patek.
Yeah. And unlike even AP, those brands are at a scale where they really can have some control and influence on the market for their watches.
It's the difference between, on the pre-owned market, CPO or non-CPO, buying, let's say, a Mercedes or an Audi or even a Porsche, and buying a Koenigsegg or Rimac. I doubt very much that there are very many dealers who sell those watches sell those cars pre-owned. But the other thing that I was going to say is that internally, when we sort of analyze the evolution of the market and where brands are or are not going and how it compares to the car market, Charles, the company CEO and founder, like, he's fond of saying the CPO market for watches is maybe 20 years behind the CPO market for cars. So if you look at what cars are today, you can imagine a world where you can walk into an authorized dealer and say, I have X brand that I want to trade in, and I want to buy a Y brand watch. And you are, as an authorized dealer or a retailer, able to offer a certified pre-owned watch from brand Y while being willing to take in a watch from brand X, and that is a widespread practice, and that there are multiple brands who are sort of, operating in that certified pre-owned space, while at the same time non-certified pre-owned options continue to exist and survive on the market, even if their position relative to where they were 20 years ago has been diminished. So there's really sort of like, you can buy new product, you can buy certified pre-owned, you can buy non-certified pre-owned, whatever makes sense for your budget, what you're looking for, where you're buying, who you're buying from, how much you trust them. Each of those factors will come into play. But for certified pre-owned, I would just like sort of repeat something I said earlier, which is I think we have to remember that, certainly as like people who sort of like car, I mean, you're technically fully in the industry because you sell watches, but we are industry adjacent in that we cover it, but we are not in the business of buying and selling watches ourselves. So we're just observing it. I think I feel very conscious of the fact that I have maybe a little bit of a bias because of that, and because we're also like sort of dyed-in-the-wool enthusiasts about watches, and we could sit here and talk about them for the next 10 hours. The average customer is not going to be like us. And the average customer will walk into a store and say, oh, this is pre-owned. That's fine. But, the brand is willing to stand behind it, and they're the ones giving me the warranty. And so if I move in 6 months cities and I have to go to a different authorized dealer and get this watch fixed if something goes wrong with it, like that, and I don't have to worry about whether this is a super clone. I don't have to worry about whether any of the parts on it were replaced, or that they were replaced with non-genuine parts, or anything like that, right? Like, that customer is going to have a peace of mind that didn't exist before, and it's going to bring in a new kind of customer. And I think the sales numbers that we see kind of bears that out. I don't think it's enthusiasts propping up the Rolex certified pre-owned market to the tune of $400 million.
No, not at all.
Well, it's funny. Last month, I sold a pre-owned watch that we carry. We mostly focus on new watches, but we have a pre-owned section, and we had a watch I was selling, and the guy wanted to get on a video call to talk about the watch and all that stuff. And this is a guy who we were chatting. We found out we're both in like the Grey NATO Slack channel. And so this is a guy, an active in that community. This is a guy who's active in the watch community, an enthusiast, collects multiple watches, found us, wanted to buy a watch, an unusual watch from us. And I asked him, what are you wearing? We're on a video call. And he was wearing a Sea Dweller he recently bought from a Rolex CPO dealer. And I was like, that's so interesting. Like, how, why is it that you decided to buy it through a CPO dealer? And he's like, oh, honestly, just peace of mind. Like, I'm just really concerned, like, with the number of horror stories I hear out there about fake Rolexes, super clones, Rolexes with fake parts. You talked about the idea of buying the dealer. Just as, there are a lot of dealers who have excellent reputations in this space, there are plenty of dealers who do not and are unscrupulous, or innocent mistakes are made. We've heard stories of dealers who have a good reputation, and I don't know where the details of any of this, who are sued or called out publicly for selling something that they didn't know was fake, or accused of that sort of thing. So he was like, yeah, I just bought it from the dealer. It was easy. They had it. I like it. And I know it's real. So it does provide some peace of mind for enthusiasts, at least in the case of Rolex. Yeah. I spoke with a guy who worked at one of these these marketplaces for used watches, these online marketplaces for used watches, a platform that does that sort of thing. And he was telling me when they did their inspections for watches that would come through them, they would come from the seller and they would be then sent on to the buyer. They found the highest number of product issues with pre-owned Rolex watches. He was like something like nearly a quarter of the Rolexes we got had something wrong with them. And that doesn't mean they were fake. Maybe one of the bracelet links was aftermarket, right? But the rest of the watch was legitimate, or the service bezel wasn't correct, or whatever it was. So I do think there is peace of mind in the case of Rolex. But the more we talk about this, the more Rolex is kind of a case study of one. And I do think it's worth talking a little bit about how Richemont has approached this, because it's totally different. I mean, both in the case of Vacheron and then through their acquisition of Watchfinder, they have a different approach than these other brands to doing it, which I think is worth taking a look at as well.
Yeah, so Vacheron announced the launch of their certified pre-owned program in partnership with Watchfinder a while back, where you can go to the Watchfinder website and they have both certified pre-owned and then non-certified pre-owned Vacheron watches for sale. So, again, to my earlier point, I think both of those products can exist, at least in theory, and certainly in this case in practice, side by side. And what they are doing is basically saying, yes, when you buy one of these, it's the brand, again, that's standing behind the watch. But I think they have something like maybe 50 watches for sale. So the scale of the program is much smaller. And to my knowledge, Watchfinder is maybe the only retailer where watches from Vacheron are available even now, some considerable time after the program was announced. That is still the case. The other interesting one is Cartier, where Cartier has partnership again with Watchfinder, but also in Cartier's case with Bucher. So they have something like 50 watches with Watchfinder, but then Bucher, across Europe, there's something like 300 listings that are available online. And in both cases, they are not really super explicit on the nature of the authentication process. So when a watch comes in, how are they checking to see, is it Cartier checking the watch? Is it Bucher checking the watch? Are the Bucher watchmakers who are authenticating the watch certified by Cartier to be, sort of competent to work on or certified to work on Cartier watches? Those are open questions in my mind. With Rolex, of course, when the watch comes in and the retailer receives it, they will have one of their Rolex certified watchmakers open it up, authenticate it, take apart the whole thing, reassemble it, regulate it, do the full service. Like any watch that comes in for a normal service, the CPO watch before it becomes CPO, or the process of becoming CPO, is really for that watch to go through the same service process. You've heard, for example, horror stories of people sending watches in and they come back polished because Rolex believes that's what their watch should be subjected to when it's gone in for a service. So CPO sort of is the same thing. And so especially for vintage products, I think you'll find people like Periscope Online screaming that they're desecrating these vintage watches. But that is the standard that Rolex applies for servicing these watches. So yeah, it's an open question, certainly for me. I'm sure there's someone out there who maybe has more information about this on what exactly the process is. So that's Cartier. IWC, I think, has experimented with it, but it's, again, maybe just a handful of listings that are only physically available in store, but not necessarily listed online. And then to go back to the only brand CEO I named earlier in the episode, Longa has, or rather I should say, the CEO has said that they are not interested in getting involved in the secondary market for their own product. So across the board, I think different brands are following different strategies. JLC, for example, has done something very interesting where they will do restored vintage watches only. And they'll do them as capsule collections where they launch just a handful of listings at a time. That's an approach that Grand Seiko has also tried, to talk about somebody completely outside of Switzerland. I think what these programs offer is a fundamentally different offering from the way that Rolex, or maybe Cartier, even with hundreds of listings, is trying to put together, where they're saying, as a customer, you can walk into a store and then at differing price points and at differing levels of availability, depending on how desirable the watch is, there will always be something in store for you to buy. So if you want to buy a tank, but you don't want to spend retail on it, the tank usually trades well below retail, or, depending on the tank. And so you can just buy one of those pre-owned. You'll be assured that the watch is genuine, but you won't have to spend as much to acquire it. But if you want a sub and you walk into a store, maybe not, well, actually with a Sub or a Daytona, maybe that this is still the case. You walk in and they say, we're sorry, sir, we don't have one to sell you right now. But if you would like to walk over to the CPO case, I can show you some that we do have in stock and that are available to purchase today. And for just the, regular Joe Schmo walking in off the street, that is a compelling customer experience where they may walk out the store with that watch in hand. So I don't think what JLC is doing or what Grand Seiko is doing is really trying to provide that sort of customer experience across their entire retail network. What they're doing is more sort of maybe highlighting their heritage or, sort of leaning into the whole, we've been here for a while and we've been doing good things for a while. And if you're interested in the history of, for example, the grammar of design or some historical references from JLC that are no longer in production and you want to buy one of those watches, here, buy it from us. But again, if they're only selling like 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 watches, it's not a lot of money.
Yeah, but I want to throw a thought in on that because to me, like that, what JLC is doing,
it's storytelling.
Well, yeah, and I believe Vacheron also does this too. I don't think they call it CPO. It was Les Cabineteurs, excuse me, forgive me, God, all the French
Cabinotier, I think.
Thank you. Oh, God, it's so bad. But yes, that, it is a brilliant move for two reasons. One, it picks the product up and puts it in a separate category, as you pointed out. So now you're not comparing, you're not going in and saying like, oh, well, this Traditionnel certified pre-owned is 20% less expensive, like the secondary market, whatever. Instead, you're saying this is a watch that it is a unique piece. So the market set on this unique piece is a completely different conversation than a certified pre-owned production watch. And, you referenced storytelling. I also think the other component to that is like there is a certain kind of like FOMO element to it because it is a unique piece, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not like you can't shop that. There's just one of them. So that sort of removes CPO from the standard secondary market dynamic and creates an entirely separate world where in the best case scenario, there's a brand lift, wow, God, this awesome Memovox that JLC just put up is rad. Maybe I should take another look at, the Polaris line.
Asher, you've put your finger on exactly why this is still a very niche case study or example of a CPO it's not even really a CPO program. It's
a marketing initiative, basically.
Yeah, it's something else. But you've put your finger on exactly why and this is my conspiracy theory purely, why we haven't seen a CPO program from a brand like Omega or even Tudor. And here's why. Those brands, are compared to Rolex all the time, right? Tudor because it's the little brother or whatever you want to call it relative to Rolex, part of the same company, shares a lot in common with Rolex. Omega because it's always trying to position itself against Rolex. You would imagine, okay, these brands, they're compared to Rolex all the time. They have similar mind share, all this sort of stuff. They've got boutiques and a dealer network. They're everywhere. Like Omega, let's take Omega. Why doesn't Omega have a CPO program? My theory is if you walked into that looks like Rolex. My theory is if you walked into an Omega retailer and they had their beautiful, and by the way, the Omega boutiques are beautiful. I've always been very impressed with them. And they have all of their new watches lined up. And then over here in the Omega boutique, now we have a CPO section. Well, guess what? That Omega Seamaster that you were just looking at, and I have WatchCharts here pulled up to help me with the data. That Omega Seamaster 300 professional that you were just looking at with a retail price of $6,200 is over here in the pre-owned box at $4,000. Well, hang on a second. That watch lost over $2,000 of value. Do I really want to even buy the new one? Is this watch even a good investment? I don't think it helps. Whereas in the case of Rolex, take the Submariner, like you said, you've got a new Submariner in the case. I don't know what they retail for, maybe about $10,000 or $11,000. And then next to it, over at the pre-owned case, you've got the same Submariner in the case for $13,000, given the markup that the CPO dealers are likely to put on it. All of a sudden, that makes the new Submariner look really good. It makes Rolex look really good. It makes the decision of buying a Rolex feel really good. And so I just don't think a lot of these brands are in the place where it's going to help them or help their dealers to have their pre-owned watches, no matter whether they're certified with a warranty and all this stuff, sitting next to their new product. It's not generally a good look. And I think that's a big part of the reason you're seeing either the brand's just not interested in the case of Swatch and Omega, or in the case of Richemont, you're seeing them try these different approaches, right? Like it's just going to be for high-end vintage stuff. It's going to be through Watchfinder. So they're not necessarily sitting in the same boutique. It's over at Watchfinder. We took the trade in, but now the watch sits over there. I think this is part of the reason why it's very hard to replicate what Rolex has done.
My take on it is, I think, different. I think I would disagree with you, but I think I'm disagreeing maybe based on intuition rather than any hard facts. I think.
Well, I mean, that's my move, so you're fine.
That's what we're here for.
I think my intuition is that we're in a particular point in time in the market where the perception is that a Rolex trades above retail, but that over the long term, we know that that has not always been the case. And that certainly the trend over the last 3 years has been that prices are declining. Fewer Rolex references trade above retail today than at any time in the last 3 to 4 years. And of course, the program does have this limit that says any watch that was produced in the last 2 years can't be turned around and sold as CPO. But if it's older than that, it's fair game, which means there's lots of current production watches that you could buy, CPO that you could also buy new. But you go in and try to buy a 126500, good luck. But CPO 126500, yeah. I mean, if they have it in the case, then you might be able to buy one. For a watch like that, yes, you will always be able to command a premium for it if you're the retailer, because that watch has traded above retail forever. But for something like a two-tone Explorer, or a steel Datejust with a non-desirable dial, or a Sea Dweller, or a two-tone Sea Dweller, or precious metal Submariners, or any number of watches in the Rolex catalog that, if I sat here and thought about them for longer, would keep coming to mind. Watches that do not necessarily trade above retail. When you turn around and sell them at CPO, you may actually be selling for less than retail. I don't have any sort of specific examples that come to mind. I wish it was sort of like a 2-second process to just look up some quick data on this. But in the interest of keeping the conversation moving, what I would say is the point that I'm trying to make is I don't think the success of the Rolex CPO program depends on these watches by and large trading above retail. I think there is a world in which the prices drop below retail for a wide variety of options, and that those exist in the case next to new watches, but for less, and people still buy. I think the value proposition in that case will be the fact that you are buying a Rolex, regardless of whether you paid more for it or less for it, and not necessarily the fact that you're thinking like you're going to lose money or something like that. Because you could buy a certified pre-owned watch for $13,000 in the example that you gave, and you could turn around and try to sell it, and you're still going to lose money on it. So I don't think that's necessarily the way that a customer would think about it. And so I don't think that's the reason why Omega isn't doing CPO. And I think in the long term, if that's what the decision makers had in mind at Rolex, then I think just based on how cyclical pricing trends in this market tend to be over the long term, that they made a good decision. Again, maybe this is me being too much of a Rolex fanboy, not on the product side, but on the business side, and saying they must have thought about this more deeply. But that's kind of where I think my intuition lands me on that question.
Well, look, we're fanboys too, and I think that's part of the I applaud the move, and I think part of the reason why Rolex launched the CPO program when they did is an indication of why. Look, they announced and rolled out their CPO program at the height of the secondary market. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think if they were at a point in time where Rolex pre-owned watches were selling comparable to retail or below retail, they wouldn't have done this. I just don't think they would have. And so, yes, the watch industry is, quote, 20 years behind the car industry on CPO. But I think, as we've pointed out, that analogy doesn't really hold up. The fundamental reason why the car industry has a CPO program is very different. It's because the car companies use CPO to help them lease new cars. Because when they have a CPO program, it helps raise the floor for used car prices and helps them calculate a higher residual value of the car and therefore lower their lease payments. That's why they do it. Because the car company owns the car while you lease it, and they want it to come off of its lease and be worth as much as possible so they can lower your monthly payment. That paradigm doesn't exist in watches, and therefore the notion that watches are behind the car industry or that's comparable doesn't exist. And I think the fact that we've seen so many approaches to CPO from the watch companies, like we've discussed, shows that comp doesn't exist. And so I think Rolex waited intentionally, and they were under pressure from their retailers who had nothing new to sell to do CPO when the market was at its height. That's no coincidence. And the dealers have control over the inventory they put in the CPO case. You know, the other thing about the other reason why the car industry does CPO is to facilitate trade-ins, right? If a dealer knows that they can make a little bit more money off of the car when they sell it, they're more likely to trade it in, and it helps with cars. Most of the inventory, I would guess, that Rolex CPO dealers have in their window are not trade-ins. These watches are not helping them facilitate the sale of new watches. They are wholesaling most of their inventory from other pre-owned dealers, and they can pick and choose what they want. Now, you're shaking your head, but when I go to a Rolex CPO dealer and I see what they're stocking and what they have inventory of, it's the desirable models that trade above retail. Are there the ugly duckling date justs and things like that in the case? Yes, but they do have agency over the watches that they decide to stock for pre-owned. But you're telling me no.
Yes, yes. So within the 8,500 listings, if you break it down by collection, the most popular collection is the Date Just. Then it's the Oyster Perpetual. Then it's Daytonas, and then I think Day Dates, GMT Masters, and then, sort of there's a long tail that ends in Cellinis and Pearl Masters. But if you add up that tail, it's not relative to the other guys like negligible. It is significant. I think also because for a retailer, they don't want to have a case where they just have one type of product for one type of customer. They want to stock across a price range. They want to stock across a type of, case material and so on and so forth. But I think this notion that you have about the inventory itself coming from wholesalers and not from trade-ins, I think is only true in some cases. I think in other cases, a lot of that inventory is in fact coming in from trade-ins, depending on the size of the retailer, depending on the markets that they operate in,
and the reference and its age.
And its reference and its age. Each of those factors I think will come into play. If you're a mom and pop AD, which most retailers, by the way, in the United States are, the majority of stores in the United States that sell Rolex are either single store authorized dealers or maybe two doors. And then there's a small handful that have more than that. I think just off the top of my head, some of the big ones are 1916 Company, of course, Sphinx, Lee Michaels, Benbridge, Watches of Switzerland, Tourneau. And I think that's maybe it. I don't know if I'm forgetting anyone else that's very, very large. But, of the 150 or so doors where Rolex is sold in the US, the vast majority of those are single stores. And so those are going to be local customers where you've had a relationship with this jeweler because you've bought watches from them, you've bought jewelry from them over maybe even generations. And so you have a two-tone bluesy sitting in the drawer that you don't really wear anymore that you bought 5 or 6 years ago. What are you going to do with it? You walk into the store and the guy says, sure, I'll trade it to you and you can buy a new watch. I think that is going to be a source of inventory for a lot of these retailers.
It is. However, Hamza, the dealer's not forced to CPO that watch. So let's say I'm the local dealer and someone wants to trade me the Pearl Master that's been sitting in their drawer, right? What am I going to do? I'm just going to turn around and dump it. I'm not gonna CPO it. It's not gonna help me sell a new watch. It's not something anyone's looking for. I'm gonna call someone on 47th Street, see how much they'll give me for the watch, take the cash, and move on. So it is. This is what I'm saying when I say like Rolex is very unique and the dealer situation is very unique, where they can really pick and choose what goes into that CPO case. They don't have to put the ugly ducklings in there. They don't have to put watches in there that are going to make it harder to sell a new watch, right? So they can pick and choose, and they can use the much larger secondary market for Rolex watches to unload undesirable inventory and not run it through the program.
Correct.
So listening to this as we wrap this up, I'm trying to like put together like a rubric for myself. And to me, it sounds like there's really three potential outcomes, and maybe some mix of these for some brands. But one potential reason a brand might engage in CPO is around brand growth, and creating some degree of brand lift, right? So that's what we're seeing with like Jaeger-LeCoultre, for example, or Vacheron Constantin, like we discussed. And I see, and that's, as Gabe points out, maybe that's a sales initiative, maybe it's a brand marketing initiative, maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe it's a marketing initiative that pays for itself, but that's sort of like one topic area. The second is around product accessibility. And that's what we see with things like Urwerk or MB&F, where there's just like not many of them. And creating this secondary channel helps get that helps make that the life of that watch longer by getting it onto other potential collectors' wrists in a approved way. And then the third is profitability, which I think still has a question mark around it in terms of, how effective these programs are going to be in terms of driving net profit, not just gross revenue, but could very well turn out to be that way. So I think, at least in my mind, brand growth, product accessibility, and profit really do appear to be the three rationales for these, or some combination thereof. Am I missing anything in there?
Just one thing that I would add, I think, that came to mind as Gabe was speaking earlier, which is that for Rolex, it's about all of those things, I would say, and this is particularly a problem for the larger brands, fakes, and the improvements in quality of the fakes. I think we get, insights from retailers, like I think Bezel put out some information about this earlier in the year, where they said, this is how many watches that come into the service center that we have to reject. I think Watchfinder has put numbers out there for that sort of insight in the past, where a significant chunk of the watches that they receive turn out to be fakes or have fake parts. And there was a time when fakes were, a joke, and you would buy them for like $200, $300. But now you can buy them for thousands of dollars. And they are certainly, without opening up the case back, virtually indistinguishable to the naked eye, perhaps even to someone who may be somewhat knowledgeable about watches. But I think the closer you look, obviously, the more it becomes obvious that something is a fake. And of course, if you open up a case back on a Rolex and the movement doesn't look exactly like a Rolex movement is supposed to look, then yes, you're going to know the hairspring's going to be wrong, the finishing might be different, the screws, shapes, and whatever. But like, it's all of these details that people always point to and say, oh, like, look, that's what makes it a fake. But that's what also serves as input to the people creating the fakes to say, if we fix this, it becomes even more indistinguishable. And I think that trend certainly has, accelerated over the last, let's say, couple of decades, where the quality of fakes has improved. So given the fact that, Rolex is making and selling over 1 million watches a year, it is the largest watch brand in the world. No matter what Apple says, we will disagree with them. The self-interest really for Rolex to control the quality of its brand in this large market is hard to overstate. I think there are lots of secondary market dealers who have sort of marketed on this exact point for a very long time, that you can buy from us and buy with confidence. And now Rolex is saying, maybe you don't have to trust those other guys. You can just trust us.
Now with even more confidence.
Yes. That this watch is 100% what is supposed to be. And if it's not, we'll make it right. So that I would say is maybe a fourth pillar, but again, it's not going to apply, and nobody's trying to fake an FP Journe.
Well,
and then trying to sell it off, as a genuine FP Journe or an Urwerk or an MB&F.
We've been surprised by the things that fakers have attempted and the watches that fakers have attempted. But I think you're right, which is to say, like, you really need to get to a certain scale, like a Rolex has, or an Omega, or brand owned by Richemont. Or you need to be at a certain scale for fakes to really matter. And I think it's a good place to end on, which is, the notion of like authenticity, because Asher, you're right. Things like a marketing or a brand initiative, accessibility for very unique products, a new profit center for a brand or a dealer. Those are all different reasons that CPO programs exist. Some from more for one reason than another, but this notion of authenticity really applies to anyone building a watch brand at scale and building a CPO program at scale. And as much as I might have a conspiracy theory that no one wants to put a watch of lesser value next to a new watch, it does matter in a world where, you're right, fakes and super clones and all this stuff are becoming more and more prevalent. The authenticity cuts across the board. If you can guarantee the authenticity of a watch, that has value no matter what. Even if that Seamaster you're looking at in the pre-owned window sells for significantly less than the new model. Okay, but I know if I buy it here at this Omega boutique, I know that it's real. And I think that may be the saving grace as watch production and faking becomes more and more prevalent. So we'll see. We're going to watch this space closely. It's interesting. We are just in the first inning. We've talked a lot about Rolex, but the sparks in the darkness we're seeing from these other brands and their approaches, I think are going to be really interesting to see how they play out and how this is adopted across the industry. So Hamza, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate you.
And thank you for listening. Open Work, of course, is a production of Collective Horology. You can find us at collectivehorology.com, and you can find our guest, Hamza Masood of WatchCharts, online at watchcharts.com. Go figure. Of course, if you'd like to get in touch with your suggestions, feedback, questions, or requests for authentication, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.